One of the results of this COVID-19 crisis that has come to us here has been the closure of schools, not just college education and campuses, but also high school campuses. One of the things that they are going to do to make up for that, of course, is to do online learning, have people go and take their classes online, submit their things online, which a lot of classes have been doing anyway, at least college-wise. And so I have to admit that when I was going to my early years in college, after I had moved away from California, in California some things happened and my education had to be changed a little bit. But as I consider my high school years, I have to say that I really cannot imagine my life having as much meaning as it did without my experiences that I had in high school and physically being on campus. The friendships that I had made, the different experiences that I had with groups, the clubs that they had there, and regular interactions with other people of my age. I don't know how many people really think about this, but if you do not have a really good social experience in high school, a lot of times you are not able to really relate socially in the real world. And these years that involve high school, of course, are among the most important because those are your early years of education. The high school that I attended in California, high school has changed quite a bit over the years. It's been about 30 years or so since I attended high school, so a lot of people might think that, oh, you do not relate right now, you do not understand the digital age, but I think that social interaction, however, is really something that's really important. One thing that you don't always think about is, even when I was a kid, I had encountered a lot of things that relate to sort of being locked up in your rooms or whatever, playing video games or doing some other things that really don't have you out in the open to interact with other people. I don't think that is very healthy as far as having people having social skills. One thing that I have been hearing about lately since COVID-19 has come and shut everything down is there has been an increase in the number of kids who have actually committed suicide, got into depression. Families are having issues interacting with each other. People are not going to work, and therefore everyone is sort of crammed in together at home. You might think that that is a healthy way for families to sort of stay together. But one thing that has to be kept in mind is that people of different ages need to interact with other people of different ages, especially children. And adults who are out of work really struggle to have to deal with that situation. People who all of their lives have been really productive and able to go out and feel the kind of, I guess I'd say, having the feeling of accomplishing something, being able to say, look at what I am doing, I am accomplishing this, and this is what my goals are, and if I do this, I can continue on and do whatever it is that particular thing is. Going back to high school, I want people of my generation to really consider what it is that high school had done for you. In high school, I had some problems of my own deciding what I wanted to do with my life, but by the end of high school, I actually knew exactly what I wanted to do. A lot of that had to do with the teachers that I had while I was going through that particular phase in my life. When I was in, I think it was 10th and 11th grade, I had a teacher, I had two teachers actually, who had a really big, significant impact on my life. They were my English teachers. I eventually would get my degree in English literature, but when I was in high school, I actually had my eye focused on science. And the reason for that was because of a lot of the books that I happened to be reading, the authors who had a significant impact on what I wanted to do, the impact that this person really gets to me, and I really feel that this is the passion that I have. If you ask a lot of people who have gone straight into a particular topic out of high school, a lot of them will say that they were inspired by what they did while they were in high school. When I was there, my English teachers everyone has to be crammed into them certain authors that they had to take. Right now, there are other authors that have been thrown in there or replaced by others, basically because we want to be more inclusive about the authors that we talk about. We want to have more of a broader experience with authors of different ethnicities and backgrounds. But when I was in high school, we emphasized the English and American authors because the English language, all of this is derived from English literature of various kinds or other. And there are three authors that really inspired me and had an impact on me. These two English teachers really helped me out. One of them that everyone has heard about and knows about, of course, is William Shakespeare. I know that there have been quite a few people who think that, well, Shakespeare is probably overrated. He really annoys a lot of people. The language is really kind of archaic and it isn't really all that exciting. To be honest, these are plays that he's mostly writing about. And if you are not acting out the play, then it's really not giving you a feeling of what the experience should be with Shakespeare. One thing, though, that you do need to understand about Shakespeare is Shakespeare, in many cases, is poetry. He used a poetic form that was called iambic pentameter. And basically, I think that it's been explained to me that the reason why that particular form was used is so that people could better remember it because they are saying these words out in a somewhat poetic form. Those people who do a lot of Shakespeare, who read a lot of Shakespeare, I guess I should say, who aren't aware of this or who watch movies that are based on Shakespeare don't always realize this because of the way it's acted out on a screen, a bit, whether it's a big screen or some kind of video that you were watching. The people, a lot of times, they quote it perfectly, or, well, they a lot of times make slight alterations to sort of suit a situation, but we won't go into that. And with this particular mode, they memorize the lines, but they don't quite have the same poetic form. They do at least sort of give the impression of keeping the emotion in there. But reading Shakespeare, though it's not the ideal in all aspects, really kind of gets you into the tempo and the appreciation of how poetry is written. I don't know how many people have gone and they have read poetry and they really don't appreciate what it is they're reading because it's just, oh, this is some boring poem. Then I have to go and I point out to them, it's like, well, look at how he presents this or she presents this. Look at how this particular topic is covered. This makes it obvious that the subject or the point of this poem is a little bit different than you normally would get just by reading the words. And so I have to explain that to some people who really don't always understand why Shakespeare is that important. I had a English teacher. I actually had the same English teacher in 10th and 11th grade. He's kind of the one who got me interested in Shakespeare, and of course, we were reading Macbeth. And one thing about Macbeth is that Macbeth portrays itself as kind of a history play because a lot of the characters that are in that play are definitely historical figures. If you compare some of the things that we know in history about these characters with what we see in the play, you might find contradiction, but That's a little bit of what we call poetic license, because these plays are essentially being written to appease an audience, especially appeasing royalty. You don't want a current king or queen to hear about you bashing their ancestor because they were a murderer or something in order to obtain the throne. And so one of the things that they started getting me to do is to go and look into the history behind this play and what it was that this particular author was trying to do with these particular words. I really found that fascinating. After I read Macbeth, and I also read Romeo and Juliet kind of grudgingly. For some reason, Romeo and Juliet, the idea of reading it just didn't appeal to me all that much. It's one of those plays that they always have you read in high school, and Romeo and Juliet had a reputation of being some mushy love story. But if you actually read the play, you'll find out that a mushy love story is not really what you're getting there. And there is a lot of emotion and feeling in there. And if a performer does it the right way, it really gets to you, and it can really affect kind of how you appreciate the play. I've seen a couple performances of it, and sometimes they can do a decent job and sometimes they can't. But while in high school, after I read Macbeth and I had it explained to me, my senior year in English class, that's the other teacher who had a big impact on me, he really showed me how to delve into these plays, and he would point out on the map. He had a map of England that was on the wall in the class, and he would go and he'd point out on the map where these particular events supposedly took place. And also with the other books that we were reading, a lot of English literature uses actual British geography and actual British locations in order to lay out what it is and where it is the events are taking place. The map on the wall was pretty intensive, pretty much in depth. My teacher went and he'd say, well, when you go here, in these parts of Scotland, this is where this particular event supposedly took place, and this is where this event took place, and this is where, like in Macbeth, this is where the English army had assembled in order to march up and depose Macbeth. So it really hit home to me saying, wow, these are actual real places. This is not just some kind of thing that someone concocted to blather out and hopefully to entertain the reader. Shakespeare still is something that really holds an important aspect in my life today. Now, the two other authors who were really significant, they fall into what we call today as speculative fiction. This is something else that high school helped me to appreciate, and especially as I met a couple friends who had similar interests as me. This kind of thing could not have happened if I was not at high school. I can't really say the high school that I was at necessarily, except for the teachers themselves that I interacted with. But when I finished reading a lot of things, I eventually went and I read every single thing that Shakespeare wrote, because I kind of got obsessed after I started studying a lot of things at Shakespeare and the poetry. But the library there at the high school, I sort of realized, you know what, there's a lot of books out there that look interesting, and maybe I should go and read those as well. Not just because a teacher is going to require me to do a book report on it, but also because these books, for some reason, they thought that these books were important to have in the library. J.R.R. Tolkien and Isaac Asimov, the other two authors, I ended up picking up The Hobbit first and read it, and then the Lord of the Rings stories. When I was younger, there were some cartoons that were about The Hobbit and Return of the King, which is the last Lord of the Rings story. With that, I found out that the stories are actually a lot different and a lot more interesting than those cartoon movies were making them out to be. With these particular books, I got so in depth, and the fantasy genre really hit me, and I started reading that. I started going in and delving into the different things that make this particular genre most interesting. I had gone in and I had looked into things like the traditions and the language of the elves and dwarves and other races that kind of got thrown in there. And these are all people, these are all different races of creatures. I don't want to call them creatures because they are sentient, I suppose. But dwarves and elves are all part of a folk tradition in many different places. And what Tolkien was trying to do was kind of create a bit of folk traditional type genre that would work with what we know today in the geography of England. And at the end of the history that he had concocted, the full history of a lot of Middle Earth, you'll discover, actually kind of builds up and then ends at the beginning of the history of England as we know it. So despite the possible Celtic origins of things like elves and dwarves, the point of Tolkien's stories was to sort of lay out some kind of introductory aspects of the history of England. I didn't quite appreciate that until much later, of course, when I was reading something that Tolkien's son had actually concocted and brought together of a lot of the writings Tolkien had that he didn't publish. And that's why you see a whole bunch of other things out there with Tolkien's name on them that weren't around when he was alive because he wasn't publishing them. Then another thing that hit me and that I think had the most influence on me, J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, influenced me with the kinds of genres that I would eventually sit down and start writing. I don't think I would have been introduced to a lot of these things if not for my high school experiences, if I haven't said that enough already. So this next author, his name is Isaac Asimov. He's an author who actually died in 1992, and a part of me is just really sad that I was never able to meet him. I was in high school at that. I was just out of high school at that time. The first book of his that I picked up, I really hadn't delved into science fiction all that much other than watching Star Trek or something. The Foundation series that he wrote was also something that they had in the library there at the high school. And the first book of the series that I picked up was called Foundation's Edge. I think I picked up that one as opposed to the others because it had a more interesting name to it, even though it wasn't the first book in the series. When I read it, it really brought home to me some ideas that I really hadn't considered before. It was because of what I was reading in Isaac Asimov that I started thinking that maybe I would be interested in studying scientific areas, especially as it relates to outer space. As I read this book, I realized that, actually, if you read Volume 4 instead of Volume 1, you're probably not going to quite understand everything you're reading. And so after I read Volume 4, I went and I read Volumes 1, 2, and 3, and a lot of things that are in Volume 4 now suddenly made sense because now I knew the history about them. And then I read Volume 5, of course, which was sort of a rolling in sequel from Volume 4. So a part of me thinks maybe I should have just read 5 right after I read 4, but that's sort of irrelevant. When I was reading these things, I suddenly found out that, okay, now I have run out of Tolkien and I've run out of Isaac Asimov, or I thought I had run out of Isaac Asimov. I went and started looking for anything that he had written. I would go and I picked up a series that was called the Lucky Star series. I picked up something that was called the Galactic Empire series and the Robots series. And I really just engulfed myself in these particular stories. everything that he had written just really hit home to me. I would go and I started buying every book of his that I could find, and so that I could read them. Besides science fiction, he also wrote a lot of scientific things. He wrote for some science fiction journals. I have not read everything of those, basically because they weren't the easiest to find, and I didn't know they existed until much later when I was a bit too preoccupied with a lot of things. But I read all these things. He was talking about scientific research, the history of several scientific areas. One of the things that I think was interesting enough for me to actually talk to my students about later in college, when I was teaching college, as I do now, was the idea of what are the concepts of science in history that have sort of been building up that might have been debunked or whatever as time progressed. And he did a lot of things where he talked about history of science. One of my favorite ones was called The Planet That Wasn't. In this particular essay, he talks about the idea of, so what ideas have we debunked over the years? One of them was the idea of there being a planet that was closer to the sun than Mercury, because in astronomy, there is a concept called perturbation. In perturbation, it's the idea that every gravitational body in the solar system has an effect on its neighbor there in the solar system. So that means that Saturn and Jupiter have interactions with each other that have to do with gravity, and so do Neptune and Mars with the asteroids around it, and Venus and Earth. Those kinds of things are pretty much scientifically set that every gravitational body has an effect on its neighbor. So there was some perturbation as it related to the planet Mercury. What that meant to a lot of scientists was that there was actually a planet that was closer to the sun than Mercury. Now, today we know that that's nonsense, but at that time that was the logical explanation for it. And this story called The Planet That Wasn't, which the essay, of course, starts out with him asking the question of whether or not the ancient Greeks knew about the rings of Saturn. And the logic behind that was pulling out a bunch of things from ancient Greek mythology about the god Vulcan, which is the Roman version of the Greek god who was the forger of the gods. I forgot his name off the top of my head, but anyways, Vulcan was, of course, the one that created the earth, and there were a bunch of other things. He didn't create the earth, sorry. Vulcan was the one who created a lot of the weapons and shields and things in the Greek epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they also bring him into the Virgil's Aeneid as well, because Aeneas can't have something created that's so wonderful without it being created by Vulcan. Aeneas, of course, is the son of Venus, who talked that god into creating it. And because of all of this, they are speculating that, maybe they did know about the rings of Saturn because of the different stories that we hear about in Greek mythology that actually kind of connect and pull together kind of the way we understand the world. But Isaac Asimov eventually sort of debunks that by laying out the story about Vulcan and how that particular subject and that particular scientific idea did not relate to. He sort of brought out how that particular idea actually was debunked by Einstein later, explaining that the sun itself and its effect on Mercury was actually the explanation for why Mercury and Venus have the effect that they do on each other, and what the pull on Mercury actually was. Then he delves into saying that, okay, The idea of coincidence is real. Otherwise, you would have to sit here and say that the ancient Greeks would have to have foreseen the entire Vulcan story in astronomy in order for coincidence not to be the case. So basically what it is the idea of coincidence. Just because the ancient Greeks had some stories about Saturn or Kronos, which is the Greek god that we call Saturn, and just because Greeks have some mythological thing that seems to correlate a little bit with how science turned out, that doesn't mean that there is no such thing as coincidence. It's science. You might hear a lot about there is no such thing as coincidence, but of course, those of us who have experienced certain things, we know that there are actually accidents and there are actually coincidences. Going back now to high school, I was reading all of these things while I was in high school. The things that I was studying in high school really built me up to what I wanted to do. The first thing that I ended up studying out of high school was astronomy and astrophysics. I found out that I was terrible with math, but I still wanted to try and get myself in there to a certain degree. I think that if we don't really appreciate what it is that we went through, the experiences that we had in high school, and the effects that they had on us. The high school experience really brought all of this to me, if not for what I had encountered in high school, if not for the things that were available to me in the library there in high school, without the teachers who directed me in the areas that I was going, that inspired me to take the different routes I was taking, I really don't think that I would have had a very good sense of purpose while I was going through that particular educational area. A lot of things people can go online. They can go watch videos of lectures. They can go and see what different things that people have written over the years on particular subjects, but that really does not replace the inspiration that someone really can get from a really good teacher in high school. There are bad teachers in high school, I will not deny that, but there are enough good teachers, and I'm sure that everyone has at least one teacher in high school that has some good effect on them. So in this day and age, with the high schools being possibly shut down for the upcoming semester, and for colleges as well, I think this is really unfortunate. High school really needs to be part of a student's life, any part of a child's life, and the growing experiences that they have. Otherwise, they might not even learn much of anything. If they are studying at home, there are very few people who can really sit down, study at home, and have that kind of experience that would really, they'd feel motivated and pushing them out there to finish up what it is that, and to come to grips with what it is they want to do with their lives. Otherwise, they might just come to the conclusion that I want to play video games for a living. Granted, there are some jobs that allow you to do video games for a living, but they are very rare, and I wouldn't count on those in order to be what it is that we do in life. Video games are fun. I did get caught up in a lot of video games in my day, and I just realized that, especially video games today, that a lot of times are really long. Video games just aren't quite what it is that you ought to be doing with your spare time when you are at that certain age. Now, you can do them some, but so many people just get caught up in doing things, and then they just do not appreciate the education experience and what it is that education has to offer you. So many times in so many situations, I just felt like I was going to give up education-wise, that I couldn't do anything, that I wasn't going to succeed, but I had a teacher or two who helped me to pick up and push on and say, yes, you can do it. Unfortunately, there are teachers out there who are not the most pleasant people to be around and who do not inspire you. They do seem to kind of bring you down because of certain things that you're not able to do as fast as everyone else. But then there's always those teachers who do make a strong impact. That is essentially what I have to say about education in high school and college, of course. What we do in high school will build up to what we do in college. Hopefully you do not have a situation like I ended up having where I had to stop college and then go back much later. It's much harder to get back into the groove and to be able to study, cram, and keep information in your head the older that you get. So really appreciate your experiences in high school, and adults always keep in mind and appreciate what it is your children are getting out of that experience. Besides education, there's the social life, the interaction with other people, and those interactions and those relationships that they have in high school actually build up most of the time into relationships that they have out of high school, whether it's when school is over and they go and do things together, or after they graduate and they interact together there. So I hope everyone has kind of appreciated what I have to say here about education, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. And may this COVID-19 situation be done with us here really soon so that regular life can return. Because I really do believe that regular life can return. I don't think that this has to be the new normal, nor do I think anything negative has to be any kind of new normal. We may have to adapt to certain things, but we do not have to accept the notion that children cannot go to school and be educated, especially with everything that we have learned over the past several months related to COVID-19. Have a wonderful day, and I will talk again soon with the next topic that comes up. I'm not sure what it'll be, but it will be something that I think is very important.